Men and women have a sometimes contentious relationship, and sometimes people use the Bible to prop this up, often citing passages like Ephesians 5:22, 1 Corinthians 7:4, or Genesis 3:16. And this is usually framed as sort of a dictatorial rulership of man over a woman. And so what we're going to do is actually look at Genesis 3:16. To the woman he said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. On the surface, it seems pretty straightforward. The word here for to rule is Mashal, which means to rule. Open and shut, straightforward. But what we'll find, I think, though, is that as we dig into this passage and some other parallel passages that use the same words and the same verbiage, we'll see that the discussion is a little bit more nuanced. So let's get started. So our first stop is going to be in Genesis 4:6-7, which is a very direct parallel to Genesis 3:16. And it reads, The Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, its desire is for you, and you must rule over it. Here, both the word for rule and the word for desire are shared between this passage and our passage. So much so that, honestly, when you read the commentaries and the literature on this, the discussion about these verses is actually in chapter 3, verse 16. So those sections in the commentaries. And so there's really two major opinions or major positions that we'll find on these. The first one is represented by Derek Kidner. Quote, this portrays a marriage relation in which control has slipped from the fully personal realm to that of indistinct urges, passive and active. To love and to cherish becomes to desire and to dominate. So again, this commentary on this verse is coming from 3:16. And Kidner keeps it sort of in the realm of the physical, where it's a physical desire, a sexual desire, in keeping with the word's usage in the Song of Songs, where it does mean that. It's really the only other usage of that word in the Bible is these two verses and in Song of Songs. The other position is by Susan Foe, and her position is summarized in the Word Biblical Commentary as follows. She has argued that the woman's urge is not a craving for her man, but an urge for independence, indeed a desire to dominate her husband. Such an interpretation of urge is required, she says, in the very closely parallel passage in 4:7. See, this is commentary from 3:16 on 4:7, like I mentioned before. These represent the two major positions on this. Either it's sort of emotional sexual desire, as with Kidner, or it's a desire for independence and autonomy, so as Foe. So what do we make of this then? Either way you slice it, the word for rule or master over it, it kind of has similar connotations. So what I want to do is take a look at one more passage from Genesis to see if we can clear this up. Genesis 1:17-18 recounts the creation of the sun and the moon. And we find the word mashal here as well, the word for rule, when we read the following. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. Here we have the sun and the moon created to bring order and division, to bring light and darkness. They separate light from darkness. They participate in this sort of creative ordering process. If you read some of John Walton's literature, The Lost World of Genesis 1, so forth, he talks about how creation, while yes, it's about creation, right? It's also about bringing order to the created universe. So, for instance, in Genesis 1, the 7-day cycle is indicative of a coordination ceremony, and so it's setting up a created order, something we don't necessarily always see, when we're just reading it from sort of our Western perspective. And so the sun and the moon here are participating, are elements of bringing order to that created order. Light specifically brings growth and brings health. I think that would have been at least somewhat apparent. We see instances of ancient peoples tracking the position of the sun and knowing when to plant and when to harvest based on where the sun was in the sky and those sorts of things. And so they would have known this. And so we see that this creation, this light is, and the way it rules is to bring order, to bring division, but also it brings growth and brings restoration. There's sort of a symbiosis here that I think is applicable to our passage and how we look at the word rule. It's symbiotic, it's cooperative, it's natural and integrated rather than foreign and opposed. So instead of a foreign king, which frankly Israel was very familiar with, became very familiar with, it's a natural order of things, a natural rule. Moving on to our actual passage, Genesis 3:16, it's important to keep in mind, and maybe I should have said this at the outset, but Tremper Longman actually brings this up in one of his works, that Hebrew narrative is by definition not wordy. There's not a lot of extra frills. There's not a lot of character details, for instance. So if we think of Genesis as a novel, if we were writing the novel, we would have an in-depth description of what Adam looked like, what was his personality like, what things were important to him. Same thing with Abraham. We would know how tall Abraham was, what color his hair was, all of these things. But we don't, because that's not how Hebrew narrative works. Hebrew narrative works on a brevity of words. And so words then become more important. And we're going to see that in this passage. We're going to see that in this verse. So we've already talked about the word Mashal and where it appears and what it means, to rule. But there's another word in here that is very important. It's the word etzev. So that's the word for pain. So your pain shall be multiplied in childbirth, for instance. That's not the normal word for pain in childbearing. And in fact, the same word is used for the pain or travail or work that Adam is going to have to do to bring produce from the ground. And so what's going on here, according to Gordon Wedham, in his commentary, he points this out, that there's a parallelism, a wordplay, or a pun going on between the word for tree and the word for pain. So the word for tree is etz, and the word for pain used here is etzev. Okay, so they have similar consonants, sound very, very similar sounding. And you might be thinking, well, this is kind of far-fetched. I don't buy it. There's a lot of words that sound the same. Well, the same thing also happens earlier on, even in chapter 3, in the end of chapter 2 into chapter 3, where the people, Adam and Eve, are described as naked, and the serpent is described as crafty. The word for naked and crafty earlier in the narrative also share this sort of verbal assonance and parallelism. So it's not foreign to even how the story has gone so far and how the writer has used words to emphasize and prefigure and call back to different elements of the story. So it is important. So the pain here, it's certainly not figurative. Pain in childbirth is very real. But in the sense of this story, the pain of childbirth and the discomfort of working the land and pain of working the land are not the same. So we can't look at this as sort of a direct literalistic reading. What it's really getting at, I think, is that the pain they're feeling is the pain of covenant loss. This is what's really in view here. This pain and discomfort of knowing how it was and knowing how it is now. How it's going versus how it's been. And so I really see that as what's going on here. It's a metaphorical, very real, but metaphorical pain that we're to see here. Not that these things aren't painful, but that the point of the story is to connect us back to the source of the pain, the tree. The woman's curse is the only one that really has anything redemptive about it. And in fact, probably you could look at it as almost part of the serpent's curse, where his seed will bruise her heel and her seed will bruise his head. So she's the only one with any redemptive aspects in it. Interestingly enough, she's the only one where her curse, or her part of this saying, this passage, doesn't involve dust. The serpent is said to crawl and eat the dust all the days of its life, which is symbolic of defeat. And Adam, the man, is said to work the earth, the Adamah, but he's going to return to dust, for from dust you came. So the woman didn't come from dust, right? And so I know Genesis 1, Genesis 3, and 2 are in some ways different accounts of things, right? But it's one narrative. They're put together for a reason. She comes out of man. She has a different origin story, and she's a different destiny, which is, I think, important to note. In conclusion, what I'm not saying is that there's no sense in which the man and the woman's relationship took a negative turn. I'm also not saying that man never ruled harshly over women. That's kind of evident just from understanding history. And what I am saying is that the passage does offer some hope in that there may be some return to the symbiosis of Genesis 1, the ordered relationships of Genesis 1. It offers redemption and links the narrative back to the original cause of pain and loss, disobedience. The only hope for redemption is through the seed of the woman. And this theme creates the book of Genesis in some ways. If we look at and read what the book of Genesis is about, it's about the miraculous conception. Think of Sarah, think of Rachel, the actions of women, the ability of women to create new life fuels the narrative of the entire book. The book of Genesis wouldn't exist in the way that we know it without this theme. And in fact, it goes all the way through from Cain to Joseph. Joseph sort of standing at the end of the book of Genesis. Bottom line, without the actions of women, without women, the story of Genesis just doesn't get very far. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey. If you'd like to see more videos like this, let me know in the comments, and be sure to like and subscribe. Thanks for joining me.